States of consciousness are exclusive and stages of consciousness are inclusive. But before we come on to what that means, the first question is, why would we even care to know? Well, if you think about it, life is radically like a game. We even use the phrase, playing the game of life. It's not always a game that we're winning or even enjoying playing, but game theory tells us that in order to play the game effectively, we need to know what the rules and parameters are, what tools are available to us, and so on. And the first tool that's available to you is your consciousness, your thoughts and your beliefs, your awareness and your mindsets, and also your states of consciousness and your stages of consciousness. So in this video, I'm going to explain the nature of both states of consciousness and stages of consciousness, and give some examples of how you can benefit from understanding both so that you can play the game of life in a more informed way. So let's start with some basic definitions then and explanations. And so we've got these two phrases: states of consciousness are exclusive and stages of consciousness are inclusive. And let's start with the first one. And at first thoughts, you might think, well, what on earth does that mean? Well, just like that, one sentence will clear it up immediately. So states of consciousness are exclusive. And the way to think about that is you can't be awake and asleep at the same time. Another way to think of it is you can't be drunk or sober at the same time. You see, so there's states, it's either one or the other. And if we wanted to extend that concept to your physical body, we could say you can't be indoors and outdoors at the same time. In the same way that a light switch can't be on and off at the same time. It's all either one or the other. And if we go back to sleep, we could say there are four stages. You've got dreaming sleep, deep dreamless sleep, then you've got the waking state, and then perhaps also you could consider the daydreaming state. But even if we expand that to four, you're still going to be in only one of those four at a time. So that's the nature of states of consciousness. Now, stages of consciousness are inclusive. So what that means is when we achieve a stage, we include and we retain the previous stages. So if we use a couple of metaphors here, the first one we could use could be like a computer game. If somebody's playing a computer game and they achieve level 17, they don't immediately forget or lose the ability to complete levels 1 to 16. They're adding those on. This is what's known as a transcend and include model. You're transcending the level that you're at, but you're including all the previous ones that have already been achieved. So these are stages of consciousness. And you could, another one, let's use the musical example. If you're learning to play the violin, you would maybe learn level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. If you get to level 4, you don't automatically lose the abilities that you've built up from levels 1 to 3. The level 4 builds on top. So again, it's a transcend and include model. So these stages are permanently there once they've been gained. So let's look at some practical examples of how we can benefit from these understandings, starting with states of consciousness. Now, have you ever had a moment where you're in the flow, you're at one with yourself, and everything you touch is like you have the Midas touch, everything you touch turns to gold, and it's all working out, and you're loving what you're doing? Well, you probably noticed that in addition to those stages, you also have the opposite types of states, where nothing is working, you feel completely rubbish and at odds with yourself. It doesn't matter what you try, you don't seem to be able to get anything going, and it's just horrible moments. So these are states of consciousness that we can understand and recognize when we're in one or the other, so that we can pay attention, and when we're in the stuck stage, rather than just sort of persevering in that stuck stage, we can draw back, take a moment, go, hang on a second, I need to look at this situation and change something, change the state of consciousness. So that's an example with states. With stages, let's look at an example like university degrees. Now, this also brings in the question of depth, and is it valid that we can talk about depth in society, in psychology? Well, the point about depth is you can talk about it if you're relating it to a certain thing or specific capacity. And we call these lines of developmental lines. These are lines of development. So, for example, if you do a degree, you don't just do a degree, it's in something, like you do a degree in mathematics or in history or chemistry or something like that. So once we understand what the developmental line is, then we can validly assess different stages of depth. And so with mathematics, you start with 2 plus 2, then you get on to maybe you do the 12 times tables, and then as you progress, you get through to algebra, geometry, all the kind of stuff where maths gets more like English and it gets a bit weird, and that's certainly where I dropped out. But these are stage progressions, you see. So these, again, you're building one on top of another. And there's a saying that we can benefit from around stages, which is that stages represent the actual milestones of growth and development. Once you get to a stage, it's an enduring acquisition. And I should say also at this point, we don't want to have any judgment around the stages that either you're at or other people are at. That isn't really what this is about. It's not going to help to make judgments about what stages people are at. It's merely an understanding of our stages so we can assess what's going on. So one thing we can understand about stages of consciousness is that everybody starts at zero at the base level. Nobody's born with an ethnocentric outlook on life. Nobody's born with a postmodern worldview. In the same way, nobody is born with an ability to recite the 12 times table in maths. Similarly, when people start playing computer games, they don't start instantly with the ability to complete a level 20 or something. Same when you're playing a musical instrument, you don't turn up from day one and already have those capacities in the back. So that starts from zero. And another insight we can make around the difference between the two is that states of consciousness are temporary and stages of consciousness are permanent. So states are temporary in that you can be asleep for so long and at some point you're going to wake up, and you can be awake for so long and at some point you're going to go back to sleep. Stages are permanent because once you've acquired them, they're permanent acquired stages of capacity that you have. So we can look at a table of characteristics here. You can see that states of consciousness are exclusive and they're temporary, and stages of consciousness are inclusive and they're permanent, and they work on a transcend and include basis. So I hope you're starting to get a sense of how these two aspects of consciousness operate, and also how you can involve that understanding in your everyday life. And so let's just look at another grid here, another table. We can actually see that there are 4 main areas where you can benefit from understanding states and stages of consciousness. So you've got states and stages as 2 things. You've also got yourself and others as 2 things. So if you multiply those up, that gives us 4 areas where you can benefit. So let's look at this table here. You can see that you can benefit from understanding states of consciousness in yourself. You can then benefit from understanding states of consciousness in other people. And you can benefit from understanding the stages of consciousness in yourself that you yourself are at. And as a 4th aspect, you can benefit from understanding the stages of consciousness that other people are at. Well, let's see that last one. Let's see if we can get an example of that. One of the stage development models that we can use is the developmental line of care and compassion. And if you have the Kissing Consciousness Handbook, you can see that on page 31. So this progression goes through egocentric, I care for myself, to ethnocentric, as in I care for myself plus my tribe, family, or nation. So typically in modern society that might mean friends and family. And then the 3rd stage is world-centric. So I care about myself, my tribe, and also all people of the world. So there's a 3-stage progression there, very simple progression. And again, without making judgments, one way we can benefit from assessing people is, let's say you're looking to have a relationship. If you can notice that somebody's quite egocentric, they only care about themselves, then you can recognize that's probably not somebody that you're going to want to have a relationship with. It's pretty obviously egocentric people don't really do relationships in quite the same way that other people do relationships, because they only care about themselves. Those of you who are familiar with Kissing Consciousness will have noticed that the binary that kissing consciousness uses is itself a state of consciousness model. You're using the notions of love consciousness to represent self-acceptance and fear consciousness to represent self-judgment and self-constriction. And so these are two different states of being, and again, they're exclusive. In any given context, you're either in a state of self-acceptance around something, or you're in self-constriction. And so let's get a table up here. This is a kissing consciousness binary table, which demonstrate a few of the characteristics there. So you can see on the one hand, you've got negative thinking and what we call positive not thinking, because there's not too much thinking involved actually. When you're in a state of self-acceptance, things flow. Lack of confidence against confidence, being your true self against being your false self, success against frustration. So you can see why this is the primary model that kissing consciousness uses to help people with personal development, because there's nothing more important than being able to be in that state where you're in self-acceptance. And this is along the same lines of the principle of getting out of your own way. That's before you can get onto anything technical that you do in order to try and achieve success, then the first thing is to make sure that you aren't self-sabotaging, you aren't getting in your own way. So this is what this is all about. And the main way that kissing consciousness uses to help you move from fear consciousness to love consciousness is the kissing consciousness tool. So we're using two questions there. These are questions that you can ask to yourself. The first is, would you like to let that go? And the second is, would you like to ask your body if it would like to let that go? Because what's happening is you've got some self-constriction, some resistance that is stopping you being in a state of self-acceptance. So those two questions to your conscious mind and then to your unconscious mind and body, nervous system, can then invite the release of whatever's blocking that. Now, actually, the first thing you do, if you want to change from fear consciousness to love consciousness, is that you notice that you're in the fear consciousness state. So rather than being identified with the stuckness that you're in, you notice it and you kind of metaphorically pull back out, think to yourself, okay, hang on, I've got to do something about this. Because if you think about it, by definition, by the time you're asking yourself those questions, the kissing consciousness tool, would you let that go? Would you like to ask your body if it would like to let that go? By the time you're doing that, you've already noticed that you're in the stuckness state, the fear consciousness state. So the first thing is simply to notice what's going on. And that's powerful because it stops you from being the victim of what's going on to a form of consciousness that's aware of what's going on, and you can start to respond consciously to it. So I hope all that was helpful for you today to start to get a sense of the difference between states of consciousness and stages of consciousness. And to help with that, of course, Kissing Consciousness can help. If you haven't already, then please do avail yourself of the Kissing Consciousness handbook. You can get that. It's available from about 6,000 stores worldwide online. You can get that if you go to kissingconsciousness.com/book. There's also a Kindle or e-reader version available. The one download serves both purposes. If you'd like to get hold of that, you can do so at kissingconsciousness.com/Kindle. And if you'd like to test it first, you'd like to try it out first, then I'd like to offer you first 2 chapters of the book absolutely free. If you click on the link below, which is kissingconsciousness.com/chapters, then you'll be able to download that for free and read the first 2 chapters as a PDF download. And so the first chapter's on flow versus stuckness. So it's very much what we've been talking about today, about states of consciousness. And the second chapter builds on that as well. So that talks about the power of love. It looks at 3 different types of love so that we can understand what the power of love actually is. And then picks one of them, which is love as acceptance and allowance, which again is the basis of love consciousness as opposed to fear consciousness. So you can see how Kissing Consciousness then builds on those 2, that binary between love consciousness and fear consciousness. And of course the whole book will then teach you about letting go of fear consciousness, the Kissing Consciousness tool, how to use that, and various other things as well. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you'd like to share in the comments below, I'd love to hear if there's a particular state or stage of consciousness that interests you, or you think that you've seen some relevance in your own life. Thanks so much for the likes and the subscribes to the channel. That really helps as well. And I'll see you again. Take care.